Well, this is going to be, I think, hopefully a very informal type discussion about how we developed our Ohio livestock care standards. And I chose my panel very carefully, but I think I chose quite wisely. Mike Bumgarner is the president and CEO of United Producers. Prior to that, he was with the Ohio Farm Bureau and did help to navigate through with HSUS to get us on the path of doing the livestock care standards. And Ohio Farm Bureau was a critical part of helping make these care standards come to fruition. So he's going to talk a bit about the history. And Candace Croney was at Ohio State at that time and teaching animal welfare, and now she's at Purdue and director of the Center for Animal Welfare Sciences there. And Candace, on our subcommittees especially, and she'll talk about those, was an integral part of, on our subcommittee panels for each species, we made sure we had producers, make sure we had veterinarians of that species, and made sure that we had academia on there. And Candace couldn't have been more help than she was where she was at Ohio State at that time, so it was a great part of that. The other gentleman sitting beside Candace is Dr. David Glauer. He was state veterinarian and convinced me to come in. It took him 2 years to do that, to come in to be his replacement. And it was funny because he told me, he said, come on in now, you're running your heads off in swine practice all over the country, and this will be a nice, smooth way to into your retirement. And so as soon as I got in, we started, got the regulations to regulate over 500 deer farms in Ohio. And next we came to regulate dangerous wild animals, lions, tigers, bears, and poisonous snakes and big constrictors. And then we had commercial high-volume dog breeders, and now I just got handed pet store. So totally away from anything I knew about livestock. So I complain sometimes, but the reality is when I look back at it, it's been a great ride for me to this point, especially because I've learned so much in the last 5 years about things I didn't know anything about. And it's been really interesting, and it's been a challenge, but it's been enjoyable. So thank you, Dr. Glauer. Our last panelist is Bryan Black, and Bryan is a very good friend of mine, not just because he's a pork producer, but who are always close to my heart. But Bryan is, I've really valued his input. I respect his opinions on about anything that he talks about. He doesn't say much, but you better listen when he does because it's very, very valuable information. And Bryan is past president of the Ohio Pork Producers Council, and he's past president of the National Pork Producers Council. So from the political aspect and the common sense aspect of things, he does a great job and is very valuable. So we're going to start out with Mike talking about a bit of the history, and then Dr. Glauer is going to talk about the process we used, and Candace is going to fill in the academic part of that, and then Bryan's going to talk about the swine part and the overall experience. And Bryan is now currently also on our Livestock Care Standards Board. And because I think swine gave up the most, and so he can address why they chose to do that and why they did that. So, Mike, I'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. This is, Tony called me, a couple weeks ago or a month ago, whatever it was, and I really didn't put a lot of time in this until the last few days or week, and it really brought back a lot of memories. Some good, some bad, but it was quite a process. And just kind of want to bring you up to speed on that. This is where it all started. February 2009, HSUS came to Ohio. And that was kind of we knew that day would probably come, but nobody, wants that day to come, but it did. And there was a meeting downtown with Mr. Purcelli and his lieutenants and a lot of the commodity people here in the state. And basically, we're given an ultimatum to change our production practices, or they were coming to the state with a ballot initiative. Well, nothing was decided, obviously, at that meeting, but what happened shortly thereafter was the creation of the Ohioans for Livestock Care PAC. And work began immediately to address what had been thrown at the industry here in the state. That group was formed with 7 groups here in the state, Ohio Farm Bureau being the leading group, and your 6 major commodity groups, Soybean Association, corn growers, cattlemen, pork producers, dairy, were all part of that. Sheep industry was all part of that discussion as they tried to figure out a plan to move forward. Obviously, the items down in the lower left-hand corner there talk about paid media, social media, fundraising strategies, coalition building, accounting, legal support, and creating a national model was kind of what was discussed and felt like what we needed to do to come at this and generate a proactive approach to dealing with this attack from HSUS. It was decided we were going to place a constitutional amendment on the ballot, issue 2. And that constitutional amendment would create the Livestock Care Standards Board, would name a 13-member panel, states how they would be named, describes the relationship with the General Assembly, and then embedded within that would be the need to have the implementation legislation defined. The board itself, the governor would appoint 10 Ohioans, 1 family farmer, 2 veterinarians, 1 food safety expert, 1 local Humane Society representative, 2 representatives from state farm organizations, the dean of Ohio College of Agriculture, and 2 Ohio consumers. The Speaker of the House and President of the Senate would each get to name 1 farmer, and then the Director of Agriculture would chair that committee. The legislation would define what the board would do. It would set the standards for care and well-being of livestock and poultry in Ohio, maintain food safety, protect locally grown and raised food, and make decisions based on facts, science, and data, and obviously that was very important. In setting those standards, it was defined within the constitutional amendment that they would have to consider overall animal health, on-farm biosecurity, animal disease prevention, food safety, affordability of food supplies, and best farm management practices. That really isn't me. Okay. This is a timeline. It's important dates. And probably the key here is when this all started in February 2009, what all occurred over the next year and roughly 15 months to June of 2010. In November, we were able to get the ballot initiative on and passed in November 2009. January 19th, legislation was introduced. March 24th, it passed the General Assembly. March 31st, the governor signed it. In April 27th, the members took oath and started the board. And on June 1st or May 6th, regional listening sessions were performed. I think Dr. Forshey did all 6 of those. And then on June 1st was the first meeting of our Ohio Livestock Care Standards Board. And we all felt pretty good at that point until here they come again. In 2010, HSUS decided they really didn't care for this approach. And they started efforts to have their own ballot initiative. And they started collecting signatures. Shortly after that, our governor at the time called everybody together, all the commodity groups, HSUS, and worked out an agreement. It was a good faith agreement. There's nothing legally binding within an agreement, but it lists the recommendations. They did settle on a group of recommendations that they would take back to the Livestock Care Standards Board. The board would consider those, was not mandatory or implied that they have to adopt it, but would consider those. And with that, we avoided another ballot initiative in 2010. Part of that agreement, HSUS agreed to support the mission and purpose of the Livestock Care Standards Board. Also in that agreement, there was supposed to be joint funding, and I won't make any comments on where we're at with that, Brian, but there was an agreement that joint funding, I think the industry, to be honest with you, had dollars willing to commit to that, and I think are the counterparts on the other side of that agreement have never come up with their share of the dollars, which is not a big surprise with that. So that kind of brings you up to speed on how all this came to be. But again, from February 2009 to June of 2010, tremendous amount of work went in. And honestly, that was just the beginning, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Glauer, I think, to make those comments.
You playing chairs?
Yeah, I'm playing chairs, musical chairs.
Thanks for the opportunity to come and address this honored group. It's been a long time since I've seen some of you, and so for the state veterinarians that are in the room, you know, if you wonder if there's a life after being a state veterinarian, you have to have Forshey as a boss. So that keeps you pretty actively employed. And so I came on this whole process I came on this process somewhere in July or August of the aspect. I got to get to where we're at, and so Dr. Forshey had got a lot of this process in place, but the board by the statute is supposed to meet 3 times a year, but in the very beginning. We met every 2 weeks, and when you add in all of the committees that you're going to see, I think Dr. Forshey's quoted that we probably had about 179 meetings from that early time in June until probably April of 2010, when we were kind of rolling all of this process together. But as Mr. Bumgarner had indicated, there were committees established, but particularly from the agreement, there were several priorities that were set by HSUS and the group that met, and euthanasia and non-ambulatory animals was high on that list, and so those were the ones that we dealt with first. And the way we dealt with this was through the establishment of species committees, as well as the Technical Research Advisory Committee. The legislation defined livestock here in Ohio for purposes of this rule, and these are the species that is covered. Under cattle, we included dairy cattle, beef cattle, and veal. They all had their own particular chapter. And poultry was divided into layers, broilers, and turkeys, and they each have their chapter in this, as you will see later. This is a busy diagram, but this is the one that Dr. Forshey was really insisted was important for you all to get the opportunity to see. And so this is a process that went on from early June until at least April of 2010. And so, first of all, there is a pointer, I think. Maybe. Well, that's what I thought, but it's not. Anyway, on the bottom left-hand side are the species subcommittees, and these were established as we worked through them. And not only were these species groups put together, but we also had chapters that dealt with euthanasia. As we worked through, we found out that we needed a chapter on general considerations, and then one that dealt with just ambulatory, non-ambulatory, disabled livestock. And so these species subcommittees were made up of veterinarians, producers, any kind of researcher, anyone that had an interest in that particular aspect, and many of the industry execs were members of this committee. But Dr. Forshey, in his wisdom, had indicated that the execs would never be the chairman; it was always a producer. So we had just really grassroots people that were working on all of these committees, and we worked through the process. When we started this back in 2010, certainly American Humane, they had some standards out, but there was not a lot written, that you had to find that was in a concise area. So we referred, and I reviewed a lot of the materials from the various states, from the various organizations. NPPC, the National Cattlemen's, they had things. Several of the states had things. Looked at a lot of stuff from the EU, the OIE, and as well as from Australia. And so that's the information that we took to these committees. They looked at it, and they're the ones then that put together the basic aspects of this. So once they finished with it, then going to the upper left-hand corner is the Technical Research Advisory Committee. Dr. Croney is going to talk about that in a bit, but they were very helpful. Those meetings were very interesting because we had a group of farmers that were interested in maybe having some minimal aspects, and then the research people, the technical people looking at it from another standpoint. And I was interested as we listened through the presentation this morning from American Humane, and those are the standards that industry is putting. When you try to take and roll those standards into something that comes about as rule, that's where it takes a lot of thinking and making this thing work. And so our rules end up to be minimal requirements that are there. And by minimal, I mean something like, that we say that you have to have adequate feed and water, to promote the health of an animal as well as for the production and or growth. So we're not saying you got to feed so many pounds. In the aspect of other gases that may be from manure pits, we did not set a limit on that. We said that you had to minimize that aspect. So once it became through the species subcommittees and track, and then we had a draft plan, a draft rule that we could use, we took it to the Ohio Livestock Care Standards Board. And they deliberated on this, and those days were really some really good meetings, and the deliberation was very good. The important part that I think that you can't forego is the one that's in the middle at the bottom, and that's public participation. At every level of this, we had public that was involved in some of the committees, but then we always had a public comment where they could supply comments either in written or orally for those meetings. And then once the care board finished with a rule, then it was filed electronically for 2 weeks, and we still got electronic comments back, and the board then considered those before we had the final rule that then went to the joint agency on rule and review. And so it might seem to you like that's a rather convoluted way of getting there, but I think the thing that's important is that it gets all of the opinions that are out there, at least in looking at this whole aspect. So this is the plan. I think, Tony, this is what you really wanted to get people to see. And so then just what we did was we had the species subcommittee meetings. They met with track. We revised it, took it to the board. The board approved the rule in draft form. It was posted. Then the board reviewed those, and then it filed with JCAR. And once you get those rules filed with JCAR, we're somewhere in the range of 100, 110 days until it becomes a final rule. And so all of the rules then, these rules, the first four chapters became effective early on. We have a chapter on euthanasia. The euthanasia chapter deals with a one-shot method, if you will, of providing that. This rule deals strictly with civil penalties. There was an aspect of where cruelty follows in that. In the revised code, we do have a cruelty section, and so we are not that group that's bringing forth like a felony or a criminal aspect from an animal abuse. We're dealing with the civil penalties that deal strictly with what is contained in the chapters of the Livestock Care Standards Board. So it varies. When we have a complaint, it is a complaint-driven rule. And so when we get those, we may get some of those from humane societies, but the issue is that they may have a case as well as we may have a case in that whole aspect. So those are the chapters that we have. that deals with this. Bryan's going to talk about the swine aspect. From the poultry aspect, when the rule became effective at the end of September of 2010, you could no longer build a new poultry facility utilizing battery cages in the state of Ohio. So in the rule, we talked about battery cages, we talked about enriched colonies, we talked about free range. And so the poultry people is not as bad as what the swine aspect. And the interesting thing, too, in the llama and alpaca chapter is that we require them to have a companion animal with them because we were concerned about the socialization of those particular animals. So as we finished up getting these rules put in place, we had 5 regional meetings again where we went out and talked to the livestock industry. Dr. Forshey was part of all of those, and we just went out and tried to explain the rules to them so that everyone had as much knowledge as they could, because this was totally a totally new aspect for them. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Croney.
Yeah. The one thing I forgot to mention, and you probably already figured this out by now, but one of Dr. Glauer's great strengths, and I learned that in the first 6 months I was assistant state veterinarian under him, is the fact that he is a great technical writer and is great at putting these rules together and dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And so he put an enormous amount of time in every one of these. And I can remember when we were talking about humane, which was talked about earlier, we spent 6 hours defining humane. And so the level of concentration of putting into these rules was good. And the other thing is, if you look at them, and when we talk about adequate feed and grain and water and whatever, it gives us actually gives us a pretty broad authority over those, and still allows us to use some common sense. So thanks to him for that. So Candace, you're up. No, we have you in here. I think, next slides. There we go.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to talk to you about the role that academia played in putting together the livestock care standards. And actually listening to Tony just now, I forgot how many of these conversations took forever. When we hear about it now, so many people have care standards boards and actually modeled after what was done in Ohio. And to give everybody here huge credit, the impact that this group has had on what people across the country have done in terms of establishing care standards for farm animals is really impressive. And you forget, after a little bit of time, how much work that actually took, and the fact that we had sometimes very contentious conversations, and then some that actually were hilarious when we talked about topics like, this is going to sound bad given what I've just said, mass euthanasia, and discussed it to the point where no one could say that phrase, and it became math euthanasia, which is really a bad way to die and not humane at all. But it was a really, really good, comprehensive process, right? No one wants to die from math. Okay. Here's really the role that Ohio State played. We were asked really to provide, as is in keeping with our duties, scientific expertise on the relevant topics of discussion, right? In regards to the specific areas of expertise that were needed, obviously given the topic that we were charged to address, we had to discuss animal welfare in great detail. And that included doing things like defining animal welfare really clearly so that everyone knew what we were talking about and that we were not, in fact, debating about rights of animals, for instance. Okay? So we're talking about it from a scientific perspective. Obviously, animal welfare is a very comprehensive term, and it covers other important areas that needed to be covered, including animal health, animal production, management, and so on. There are many other disciplines that were really reflected there. We also helped to identify the additional expertise that perhaps we did not have well represented or represented enough from Ohio, and sometimes it's really important to have external perspective. So we helped to identify other experts who could help to make this an even more robust process than it was. Several of the meetings that Dr. Forshey talked about were held at the Ohio State campus, so we facilitated hosting those meetings and bringing people together. And the public education and outreach component was an area that Ohio State played a major role because, of course, given that this topic was of such importance to the livestock industries and poultry industries in Ohio, it was important that producers understood what was happening and why, but it was just as important that interested members of the public knew what was going on and why, and that we were really clear in terms of what we were talking about and what the goals were of what we were trying to accomplish. So we definitely helped with that, and I had the privilege, as did many of my colleagues, of working with everybody here and others who are not here, but including staff from the Ohio Department of Ag, other members of the Ohio Farm Bureau, and several different industry leaders. Here's just an example of the scientific expertise that was represented on that technical research advisory committee that Dr. Glauer mentioned before. We had many faculty from the Department of Animal Sciences, and then we also had input from the College of Veterinary Medicine as well. Several of the folks who were involved here have now sort of moved on to other positions. So these are the positions that they held at the time. Dr. Kinder was the Animal Sciences Department head. He has now moved on to a different position. Dr. Naomi Botheris has actually gone back to Australia. And Dr. Forshey worked me so hard I was forced to seek employment elsewhere at a university west, where I wouldn't have PTSD from having to say words like mass euthanasia. Okay, my role is very, very simple. It really involved, starting us off, making sure, like I mentioned before, that we had clear definitions of animal welfare to begin with. I also put together several overviews of key topics that were relevant to the conversations we were having. Again, because so much of this was so new to the state, it was really important that people understood the specific welfare issues we were talking about and why, in fact, we were talking about them, right? We also had to do a lot of sort of backroom conversations, not backroom from the standpoint of it being a bad thing that we didn't want people to know about, but again, giving credit to the folks here, because no one had done this before, it was really difficult. We had to think about what was even the best way to go about writing these standards and thinking about putting together these standards, right? So we had to think about what were the options for moving forward. Did we want to start with a species focus, or did we want to just start with the issues that HSUS had put on the table and then work our way backwards from there? And ultimately, as you see, Dr. Glauer has mentioned that we ultimately decided the best thing to do was take a comprehensive approach and work species by species. Right? So then the other role that I had was to really make sure that I gave as much advice and technical support as possible in terms of both the science that was being put on the table, and then once those standards were written, work closely with Dr. Glauer in terms of making sure that then what was written into the law actually reflected accurately those conversations that we'd had, and that we didn't inadvertently sort of get the science wrong in the process. And that actually is really, really difficult to do, and kudos to him, because I learned so much from the process of making language precise and making sure that what actually was said is what was intended. Here are some of the areas that we were discussing at the time. We are discussing all of these issues still today on a national and a global perspective, but the housing issues relative to livestock and poultry species were particularly problematic. It was an issue that HSUS had really made a lot of effort to prioritize, so we absolutely wanted to make sure we did a good job of addressing those. And then the last component that I'll leave with you is one of the factors that this board really had to consider is how really to comprehensively think about making good policy relative to animal care, right? And so what needed to happen is obviously prioritize the animals. That was the purpose of the exercise. But we also needed to think about the really broad implications of the process and what was ultimately written. Right? And so factors that had to come into play there included the impacts on farmers or producers. We also had to focus on, what were the interests of concerned citizens, including those from outside of the state who'd raised the issues that we were going to address. Environmental impacts of some of the policies that were put into place had to get discussed. And last, what we wanted to do is make sure that the process ultimately was respectful of the concern that what should happen is a process that allowed us to actually act, or allow the state to act so that it was practical, but also that it considered, in terms of what was put forth, the importance of making sure that we weren't writing things that would lead to problems with food access for John Q. Public, including increased prices, simply because what we might be writing down would require such a change in management or such difficult or different management that it could actually fundamentally make pricing and accessibility to food potential problems. So with that, that was our role as far as academics, and we get to hear from Bryan.
Thanks, Candace.
Well, thanks, Dr. Forshey, and I can empathize with you when Dr. Glauer told you that it would be an ease into retirement. I got the same spiel when I was interviewed for National Pork Producers Council and said that I might be gone five meetings a year. 6 years later, I was gone about 160 days when I was president of that organization. So don't always believe what your peers tell you, I believe. So my role in this presentation is to kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of actually being a chair of the subcommittee for swine. As Dr. Forshey mentioned, I believe swine was probably the most affected as far as a industry in Ohio. Obviously, there are things that are happening in the dairy side and the veal. We don't have a big veal presence in Ohio, and it's getting even less. Some of the dairy aspects were coming down the pike from the National Dairy Associations anyway. But the pork industry was going to have to bite a big bullet, and the big elephant in the room, of course, was eliminating the use of gestation stalls. So, I got a lot of heat early on from my fellow producers asking, first of all, why did we agree to this in the first place? Why didn't we just fight and have another ballot referendum? Well, I think you can see from national history that you're going to lose that battle 60-40 every time. The reason we won state issue 2 was that we took the offensive. We set the parameters of the ballot initiative, and we won 60-40. But the thing that it did do, and Mike didn't allude to it, is it bought the industry time. And all these other ballot initiatives, as you could see from some of the other speakers, they had a period of 5 to 6 years to make that transformation, where with the agreement that our folks here in Ohio made, we basically had 15 years, and the argument was that if someone had just built a new facility, that it wouldn't even be depreciated out, and the useful life of that facility in 15 years. So we got from the date of the agreement to 2025. A couple other things that was in there was that any new construction after the date of the agreement did have to implement loose housing. There was a mention of shared research that Mike talked about. One of the main researches that we wanted to do as a swine industry was actually do a research on which housing system was best for pregnant sows. I mean, at that time, and probably at this time, we still don't know, is it RFID tags in a loose housing system going through a feeding station? Is it, for lack of a better term, freestall type system where you take the back gates out? And we made that plea to HSUS and wanted to have a research program or project, but we also wanted to include gestation stalls themselves, and they would not sign off on that agreement because I'm sure they probably realized that gestation stalls from a productive standpoint and an animal welfare standpoint would have ranked extremely high in that. So I need to move here. Would I hit this way? Well, no, that's mine. There we go. So we had to do a lot of terms. What we said was that an existing facility means that any building on a farm that housed swine in the past would be eligible to be converted and considered an existing facility. Remember, I said if anything new built, it had to be on loose housing. So someone could technically come in to an existing facility, put stalls in it, and use it as a gestation stall. through this whole process, and we had a tremendous committee that I worked with academia, with Candace. We had representation from American Humane. But the big thing was that we had to create these rules for the wide gamut of the swine industry in Ohio. Not only the modern production systems, but also the backyard systems, the pasture raised. So we had to come up with wording that would satisfy on a broad sense all of those systems. And I will readily agree with Dr. Forshey. Dr. Glauer was the Thomas Jefferson of his day as far as wordsmithing the things that we needed to have in those. And but we had to do two things. We had to make it workable for the industry, but we also had to pass it by HSUS and have it pass the smell test as far as if they would accept it. And I probably am one of the few in this room that still have Wayne Pacelli's contact number in my phone book because I have had several conversations with him. And actually, I think we did get a couple of wins in that. One of them was that we said that we could use, when we changed the word gestation stalls to breeding stalls, and that we could use those stalls post-weaning until the sows were confirmed pregnant. And we needed to do that for a couple of reasons. Number one being that all production systems don't flow in the same manner, and some folks are readily able to detect pregnancy at 28 days. Others take 35. Some take 50. The old staunch Germans in western Ohio, if she's starting to put an udder on, we know she's pregnant. So we made that broad enough that we could use that. We also allowed for gestation stalls as a hospital pen. And the problem was there, if we had a thin sow that was not surviving in a group housing system, we wanted the ability to bring that sow into a gestation individual stall. The same way with a boss sow. We could let the producer pick if there was a very aggressive sow in a loose housing system, we could get her into an individual system. So a few things that we did kind of get some wins on. I'm probably hitting the slides or talking about the slides, but anyway, we have to have full compliance by 2025. Many of our larger producers in the state who have built facilities since this rule came into effect have implemented loose housing systems. I know the company that I work, Kalmbach Feeds and Kalmbach Swine Management, has put some systems in where they have, for lack of, I'm going to call them a free stall, where they can freely go in and out of a gestation type stall. They can get locked down to get fed so that boss sows can't back in and bite the tail of a lesser pen mate and get overfed. These systems all present different challenges. Everyone that I've talked to says that yes, we can manage them, but it takes a completely different mindset and management set of skills to make these work. But we are still being very productive with the systems that we have in place. And now the big key is that as we're getting closer to 2025 and we're 8 years out, getting the rest of the industry on board as we move through. So I think I've touched on about everything that I wanted to, so I think I'll quit at this point.
Okay, thanks. Before we take questions, I just jotted down a few notes as we were going along, and I forget how many meetings we actually had. But we met every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 14 months. And so it took up almost 70% of my time. And the only other person or group that was attended all those meetings that I attended except one was HSUS. And the trials and tribulations of when we started this process is, how are we going to talk about this stuff with HSUS in the room? But the bottom line, it was very easy, and it was very beneficial to have them in the room. They saw how hard we worked. They saw that we were diligent, we were genuine, we were passionate about what we do with animal care. And the other thing that was our advantage is they didn't have a clue about any production system. They knew nothing. And so that was to our advantage. The Livestock Care Standards Board is a standalone board in the state of Ohio. It's like the Board of Education or any other board. It's a standalone board that happens to be housed at the Ohio Department of Agriculture and happens to have as its chairman the Director of Agriculture, and then as vice chairman, the director appoints that person, and that's always been me to date at least. So it's a totally standard board. The other kudos, again, I'll bring out is to Ohio Farm Bureau and to the Ohio Livestock Coalition. Ohio Livestock Coalition, and I don't know of any other state that has anything quite like Ohio does, but it's made up of all the commodity groups. And as you saw from our reception the other night, certainly want to thank all the sponsors we had. Merck and USDA stepped up to the plate big time to have our annual conference here. But when you look at the other sponsors, every commodity group in Ohio contributed dollars. In fact, they paid for our reception the other night. So they speak with one voice. And when they get in a room and start talking about things, and they have meetings 2 or 3 times a year, they will talk about issues as it relates to agriculture, and they'll come to a consensus and agreement, and they always speak with one voice. That doesn't occur in other states. In fact, Michigan failed horribly when HSUS went to there because some of the commodity groups gave in very readily without consulting others. So we're very fortunate in Ohio to have that. The other thing that you realize with the livestock care standards is it really gives the commodity groups, particularly the species commodity groups, a way to police themselves. So anytime somebody drives down the road and sees a bunch of junk in a field and gates laying around and bent up and trash and waters with dirty water in them and that sort of thing, it really puts a bad eye on all of agriculture. And so it's a way for us to police those individuals and get those areas cleaned up. And the complaints, it's all complaint driven. And so when we go out and do these complaints, we basically tell the people, look, you're going to clean this up and you're going to come into compliance. If you don't, we'll eventually fine you and take you to court. We are in the process today of doing our first one of those. We've always gotten people to come into compliance. And what I've told them is if you don't clean this up, the next person that drives down the road is going to call me again. And I'm not going to waste taxpayers' money to keep coming out here. I'm not going to do that. So you're going to clean it up now. And so it's been pretty well. The complaints, I think, were supposed to be against CAFOs. We've yet to be in a CAFO. They're always the backyard people who have old McDonald's farm with everything laying around in junk. They could care less about the livestock care standards. They could care less about whether they know them or whether they abide by them. So it's been a lot of work and education, continual education on our part, to be able to get those people into compliance. So in Ohio, we talked about our penalties, our civil penalties. In Ohio, the local humane societies in the counties have authority over cruelty. So we overlap with the livestock care standards occasionally, and more often today than when we started. Because as Judge Chesham talked about, local prosecuting attorneys, we can't get them, humane societies can't get them to prosecute a cruelty case. They just got too many drugs and murders and whatever else they got to do, even though it's in their statute of law that they're the ones that take care of those. They just don't do it. So those humane societies rely on us to help them from the standpoint of thin horses or thin cows or whatever it may be. We end up taking the livestock care standards approach on them of adequate feed and water and et cetera. So we stretch the line a little bit to get that job done, and it's unfortunate, but prosecutors don't do their job, and they're not going to when it comes to this. It's just not important and high on their list. So with that, Andy, I think we'll open it up to questions that anybody may have, and we'll try to answer them. James?
Thanks, everybody, for sharing your perspective, and thank you, Dr. Forshey, for pointing out the shortcomings of Michigan. We greatly appreciate that.
We try to. That. My wife is a Cornhusker, and so when we were up at North Central USHA last year, we drove by the stadium at Michigan State because we did a little tour, and James was quick to point out that this is their stadium. He was puffing his chest out, and my wife says to him, "See, did you guys get beat last year in football? Who was it beat you?" It was Nebraska. And so James knows not to challenge too far.
Exactly. So I guess it's more of a, we all appreciate and understand what you did to address the animal care here in Michigan and fight the political pressure with the HSUS was bringing on you and so forth. And so I guess my question, just chatting and listening, would be interested in hearing from the panelists is, how much of a role should there be involved from a regulatory standpoint with animal welfare? So you have a care board that's been created here in Ohio. The lawyers have shared different perspectives of what statutes are out there from an animal welfare standpoint. But I guess a question to you all, just to get your perspective, is how strong of an involvement from a regulatory standpoint should animal welfare be? Or should it be more industry-led and allow those third-party audits and so forth, like the farm program on the dairy side? So just kind of be curious to hear your perspectives.
I guess I get to start with the easy question. I think there are a couple ways you can look at that question, right? Because my personal bias is I don't like a lot of legislation, particularly when it comes to animal welfare, and it's only because if you get something wrong, trying to undo it becomes really unwieldy, right? That said, I agree with people that there are certain things that ought to be encoded in the law that we all agree on are really important, that we all agree to uphold. And I think what you really should have happening is you have those basic, agreed upon, really important components without which we all agree animals are going to be compromised and other factors will be as well. And that should complement the industry approaches to self-regulation, right? I actually don't think the industries can function very well if all they have is legislation. I think part of the problem we have in animal agriculture today is there are very few models of industry going above and beyond to regulate themselves and to really demonstrate that animal welfare is a priority and that it's a top priority, right? So I think you need both.
Yes, I agree with her. No, obviously it should be an industry-led effort, okay? But with that being said, reality is if we don't have the regulatory side or the legislative side helping us, we have issues. So I think we have to be proactive on both sides. But I agree with Candace, it needs to be limited. I mean, obviously, once you start down this path, you have the concerns on mission creep and getting in too far, too much detail, going too far. But we need to embrace that to protect us in today's world. And I hate to say that, but that's a reality we have to deal with.
Bryan, do you want to comment? Okay, Dr. Glauer.
I agree with the comments that have been made. I think that we need both. In our specific situation, we were pushed to get to that regulatory aspect, and we needed to get there. But I'm glad that the industry is stepping up, and particularly the consumers. The restaurants. That are requiring some things to be done in production. I think that our rules marry very well with the requirements that industry is putting forth.
Chelsea.
You had to do all over again, what one thing would you do different?
That's a great question.
Start in 1999 instead of 2009. No, I think that's right. I think the industry allowed itself to get behind, and we lost the ownership of the issue. And now we're struggling to get it back. I think we've made great strides in the last 5-7 years, but we still have a ways to go. But I think we are on the right track, and I think the initiative we took here, I think, was a model. Things we do differently, I'm sure we all would look at that, and we were forced to deal with it in a very short timeline. Now, maybe that might have been good, but there was a lot of hours, a lot of time, a lot of energy, capital, you name it, it was all there. You know, I have one comment that I will make, and Dr. Forshey said HSUS was every meeting. Leah Dorn was at every meeting. And now she became quite painful to some people, okay, which was good. You know, and that was the whole process we went through. So I'm not sure as far as the process. I look back and I feel pretty good with what we did and where we ended up.
Yeah, I agree. As I said, Leah worked for Farm Bureau at the time, and Farm Bureau was a critical part of getting this done. The other thing I'll tell you is that there have been, and Chelsea hit on this a bit in her presentation about other states that have tried to do what we did. Our timing was right to be proactive to get it done. But if you don't have legislative support to give you the authority to do it, you're in trouble. And today's world, let's face it, we're getting more and more animal activists in Congress and in state legislators, and it's becoming harder and harder to get that authority to do the rulemaking. Roger?
This is a statement, Andy, but I want to follow up with because I was going to say it before Mike said, because I'm the keeper of the notes at Farm Bureau now, and Leah, I inherited books and books and books and books of her notes, and they sit in a file there on my desk, and the whole history of everything that we did through Farm Bureau is sitting there. But the one statement that I really wanted to make is there's 2 huge folders of letters of support, forms of support from mayors and jurisdictions and people from all over the state that are very important for us to maintain this, and we're going to maintain those records if anybody ever comes back to us and says, who supported this? We had a lot of support across the state from little companies, little cities, little towns, mayors, every place across the state, and that was extremely important for the successful passage of this. And yes, Leah, I will keep your notes until I retire and then give them to somebody else.
Thanks. Yeah, you know, we struggled a lot with the veal and about where to go to group housing and that sort of thing, and the problems with navel sucking and other things. We went through the same thing with the swine. Group housing, pigs fight. And they'll fight every day, and they'll bloody each other. And we actually took the board one day to one of our producers, and I called the producer, and I said, we're going to come on Thursday because you're going to wean on Monday, and they're going to start coming to heat on Thursday, and they're going to be bloodied up on Thursday. We took the board up there, some of which had never been on a farm in their life, and took them in and saw them. They said, but why these sows are bleeding? They're beating each other up. That's what they do. That's what chickens do. And so Janet Swanson had done some great work at Michigan State on cage size. You know, we're at 67 square inches. And when we went up higher, over 100 square inches, we saw egg production drop because the cannibalism started. We gave them so much room, they fought. And so, you know, just because we think about these things, we have to understand how different animals act in real life. And it becomes very important when we talk about those things. Yes?
Hi, Tony. Nancy Halpern, former state vet, New Jersey. So when we wrote our standards and then defended them before the Supreme Court, I quantified the cost. And it was a quarter of our budget for 1 year. It was over $500,000. So how much did this cost the state of Ohio, including the initial promulgation of the standards, and how much does it cost to regulate?
Well, the regulation part, I'll answer that, and I'll let Mike do the other part. From a regulatory standpoint, we average one a week to do that. And our field staff, I have 4 veterinarians out in the field strategically placed around the state, and we have 8 livestock inspectors, so I have a total of 12 field staff. We typically use USDA interchangeably. We have a great relationship with Dr. Skrupski and USDA, and we use our field staff interchangeably. We don't do that with the livestock care. We don't think it's their part to have to do our police work. So our 12 people, and there are different areas around the state that we have issues, but it doesn't take a lot of our time. You know, we do a visit, and then we give an NOV, a notice of violation of what's wrong with the livestock care standards. We calculate in our own head because we understand farming. And so we know about how long it would take them to clean that up, whether it's 2 weeks or a month or 6 weeks. If it's manure pack inside a barn and it's raining like it's been out here now and you can't get out in the field to spread it, we take all that into consideration. We go back and follow up and make sure that they've corrected that issue. Sometimes it requires the third follow-up. It doesn't take a lot of our time. So from an expense standpoint, and we have no budget for this. We were given no money, so it comes out of our GRF funds. And so I consider it part of our daily routines. And so we work them in, and we get there within 24 hours for the most part to make sure we follow up on those quickly. Then we make sure we contact the person that complained about it, because everybody wants to know who complained about me. We don't necessarily tell them that. They tell them because of FOIA, we have to tell them eventually. So if they request it to our legal staff, we will tell them. But basically, we leave a report and everything that way to do that. So that's just part of our normal routine. Mike, can you address even close to what it costs us to do this?
Well, as far as the campaign itself to create the constitutional amendment, and Leah, jump in here if I say something wrong, because I'm getting to that point in time, my memory's starting to be gone. But I think it was roughly $2 million for the campaign that we raised through the PAC to get it on the ballot and promote that and see the passage of that. Now, that doesn't include, obviously, and I didn't really give you any background as far as my time at Farm Bureau, but I started with Farm Bureau in July of 2009 after this got started. And that was the creation of what they called at the time the Center for Food and Animal Issues. And the center is kind of morphed a little bit through the years, but the whole idea of the center was primarily to deal with this issue and to work on this. Now, moved into other things once it was passed, so Farm Bureau made a substantial commitment to it. I always said, you know, from a long-term standpoint, as you think about the center, of what they were trying to do within Farm Bureau, if we were successful within the center, our lobbyists would have been put out of a job. Okay, and the intent was, don't get nervous, Tony. Okay, but the intent of the center was to take these issues and deal with them head on before we had to deal with them from a legislative standpoint. That was the whole intent, long-term vision. And I think from an industry standpoint, back to one of the earlier questions, that's really where the industry is evolving to. And, you know, I know even Leah today in her job deals a lot with this indirectly or directly, but there's a lot of money being thrown at dealing with these issues before we have to get to this point and deal with them legislatively. But there is substantial money to all these efforts.
Might also add that 2009 was very strategic, and because if you look at it, it was an off-year election. That's one thing. So you're not, even the money that you got or you have is going to go farther in TV advertising, that sort of thing. Secondly, instead of going with volunteers going out and getting signatures, we went the legislative route. So that reduced the manpower of having to have volunteers go to shopping centers and wherever and get signatures and have them validated and all that. So there was a couple of things that was working in our favor in 2009. I might mention, and it hasn't been mentioned yet, the violations that we're seeing, they're kind of on the I-71 corridor for a lot of it. I mean, so that, you know, the people are driving by and they'll see a cow that maybe is either undernutrition or doesn't have a visible shed to get under, and they might be driving through in a snowstorm or rainstorm. But as was mentioned, no modern or working, I guess I would say working productive farms have very little, if ever, been notified as a violation.
Yeah, and you know, we're dealing with the public. We're 4 or 5 generations away from the farm, and people driving up down the interstate. One call I got one day, a lady was panicking. There were 6 dead horses laying out in the field, and she was convinced of that. It was the first sunny day we had, and they were stretching out there just enjoying the sunlight. So that's what we deal with, and we screen these calls when they come in. And so it's just a fact.
Well, folks, let's give this panel a round of applause.